Poverty and unemployment forced the Victorian homeless to sleep outside or in empty buildings, but if they were to earn a little money by casual work, begging, or some perhaps by picking pockets, they could temporarily relieve the suffering caused by biting cold and freezing rain by spending a night in a common lodging house, also known colloquially as a dot house or a flop house in American English. This was respite of sorts, for it offered cheap shelter and the opportunity, if it was available, of warmth from a fire and a place to cook food, if you could afford it. But this low-cost reprieve from the hardship of tramping the streets was tinged with the menace of sharing your time in the same room with many strangers, some of a kindly disposition, the unfortunate man fallen on hard times, others of a menacing appearance, which, for your own safety, you might do well to avoid. All, however, were hungry and destitute. Today, in an account from the 1850s, by a Victorian social investigator, you will discover the misery of a stay in one of London's lodging houses. Find out what happened to men to bring them so low as to stay in such a terrible place, which looked little more than a dirty stable yard. You will discover a place of squalor, swarming with vermin and heavy with smoke and repulsive smells, through which was a haunting sight. Gaunt, exhausted, and desperately hungry men, tearing at whatever food they could get, as if it were the last meal they would ever see. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. The exposition of the labouring classes and review of their social condition would have been incomplete unless the Commissioner had included in his scheme a searching inquiry into the inner life of a yet lower grade than the ill-paid artisan. In the lower depths there is a deeper still, and beyond the needlewomen and the agricultural labourer there is a class still more inviting to a pure and enlightened benevolence. Although to one actuated by a lesser motive, it would be difficult to overcome the inevitable disgust that would attend a personal survey of their condition. The following is a picture of what we dare hardly call the domestic economy of the casual labourer. The daguerreotype, truth alone, can give an interest to the recital of such a mass of misery. At length we reached the lodging-house. It was night when I had first visited the place, and all now was new to me. The entrance was through a large pair of green gates, which gave it somewhat the appearance of a stable-yard. Over the kitchen door there hung a clothesline, on which was a wet shirt and a pair of ragged canvas trousers, brown with tar. Entering the kitchen, we found it so full of smoke that the sun's rays, which shot slantingly down through a broken tile in the roof, looked like a shaft of light cut through the fog. The flue of the chimney stood out from the bare brick wall like a buttress, and was black all the way up with smoke. The beams which hung down from the roof and ran from wall to wall were of the same colour, and in the centre, to light the room, was a rude iron gas pipe, such as are used at night when the streets are turned up. The floor was unboarded, and a wooden seat projected from the wall all round the room. In front of this was ranged a series of tables, on which lolled dozing men. A number of inmates was grouped around the fire, some kneeling, toasting herrings, of which the place smelt strongly, others without shirts, seated on the ground, close beside it, for warmth, and others drying the ends of cigars they had picked up in the streets. As we entered, the men rose, and never was so motley and so ragged an assembly seen. Their hair was matted like flocks of wool, and their chins were grimy with their unshorn beards. Some were in dirty smock frocks, others in old red plush waistcoats with long sleeves. One was dressed in an old shooting jacket with large wooden buttons, a second in a sailor's blue flannel shirt, and a third, a mere boy, wore a long camlet coat which reached to his heels, and the ends of the sleeves hanging over his hands. The features of the lodgers wore a very kind expression. One lad was positively handsome, and there was a frankness in his face and a straightforward look in his eye that strongly impressed me with a sense of his honesty, even though I was assured he was a confirmed pickpocket. The young thief who had brought back the 11.5 change out of the 1 shilling that had been entrusted to him on the preceding evening was far from prepossessing, now that I could see him better. His cheekbones were high, while his hair, cut close to the top, with a valance of locks, as it were, left hanging in front, made me look upon him with no slight suspicion. On the form at the edge of the kitchen was one whose squalor and wretchedness produced a feeling approaching to awe. His eyes were sunk deep in his head, his cheeks were drawn in, and his nostrils pinched with evident want, while his dark, stubby beard gave a grimness to his appearance that was almost demonic. And yet there was a patience in his look that was almost pitiable. His clothes were black and shiny at every fold with grease, and his coarse shirt was so brown with long wearing that it was only by close inspection you could see that it had been a checked one. On his feet he had a pair of ladies' side-laced boots, the toes of which had been cut off, so that he might get them on. I never beheld so gaunt a picture of famine. To this day the figure of the man haunts me. The dinner had been provided for 30, but the news of the treat had spread, and there was a muster of 50. We hardly knew how to act. It was, however, left to those whose names had been taken down as being present on the previous evening to say what should be done, and the answer from one to all was that the newcomers were to share the feast with them. The dinner was then half portioned out in an adjoining outhouse into 25 platefuls, the entire stock of crockery belonging to the establishment numbering no more, and afterwards handed into the kitchen through a small window to each party as his name was called out. As the hungry man received his plate, he hurried to the seat behind the bare table and commenced tearing the meat asunder with his fingers, for knives and forks were unknown there. Some, it is true, used bits of wood like skewers, but this seemed almost like affectation in such a place. Others sat on the ground with the plate of meat and pudding on their laps, while the beggar boy, immediately on receiving his portion, danced along the room, whirling the plate round on his thumb as he went, and then, dipping his nose in the plate, seized a potato in his mouth. I must confess the sight of the hungry crowd, gnawing their food, was far from pleasant to contemplate, so while the dinner was being discussed, I sought to learn from those who remained to be helped how they had fallen to so degrading a state. A sailor had assured me he had been robbed of his mariner's ticket, that he could not procure another under 18 shillings, and not having as many pence, he was unable to obtain another ship. What could he do? He said. He knew no trade. He could only get employment occasionally as a labourer at the docks, and this was so seldom that if it had not been for the few things he had, he must have starved outright. The good-looking youth I have before spoken of wanted but £3 10 shillings to get back to America. He had worked his passage over here, had fallen into bad company, been imprisoned 3 times for picking pockets, and was heartily wearied of his present course. He could get no work. In America he would be happy and among his friends again. I spoke to the gentleman who had brought me to the spot, and who knew them all well. His answers, however, gave me little hope. The boy, whose face seemed beaming with innate frankness and honesty, had been apprenticed by him to a shoe-stitcher. But no, he preferred vagrancy to work. I could have sworn he was a trustworthy lad, and shall never believe in looks again. The Commissioner of the Morning Chronicle goes on to observe, knowing that this lodging-house might be taken as a sample of the class now abounding in London, and moreover having been informed by those who made the subject their peculiar study, that the characters generally congregated there constituted a fair average of the callings and habits of those who resort to the low lodging-houses of London. I was determined to avail myself of the acquaintances I had made in this quarter in order to arrive at some more definite information upon these places that had yet been made public. I deal with a class of houses, and not with any particular house, be it understood. The lodging house to which I more particularly allude makes up as many as 84 bunks or beds, for which 2d per night is charged. For this sum, the parties lodging there for the night are entitled to the use of the kitchen for the following day. In this a fire is kept all day long, at which they are allowed to cook their food. The kitchen opens at 5 in the morning and closes at about 11 at night, after which hour no fresh lodger is taken in, and all those who slept in the house the night before, but who have not sufficient money to pay for their bed at that time, are turned out. Strangers, upon arriving in the course of the day, must procure a tin ticket by paying 2d at the wicket in the office, previous to being allowed to enter the kitchen. The kitchen is about 40 feet long by 15 feet wide. The sleeping room is about 48 feet deep by 40 feet wide. The bunks are each about 7 feet long and 1 foot 10 inches wide, and the grating on which the straw mattress is placed is about 12 inches from the ground. The wooden partitions between the bunks are about 4 feet high. The coverings are a leather or a rug, but leathers are generally preferred. Of these bunks there are 5 rows of about 24 feet deep, 2 rows being placed head to head, with a gangway between each of such 2 rows and the other row against the wall. The average number of persons sleeping in this house of a night is 60. Of these, there are generally about 30 pickpockets, 10 street beggars, a few infirm old people who subsist occasionally upon parish relief, and occasionally upon charity, 10 or 15 dock labourers, about the same number of low and precarious callings, such as the neighbourhood affords, and a few persons who have been in good circumstances, but who have been reduced, from a variety of causes. At one time, there were as many as 9 persons lodging in this house, who subsisted by picking up dogs' dung out of the streets, getting about 5 shillings for every basketful. The earnings of one of these men were known to average 9 shillings a week. There are generally lodging in the house a few bone grubbers who pick up bones, iron, rags, etc., out of the streets. Their average earnings are about 1 shilling per day. There are several mudlarks, or youths, who go down to the waterside when the tide is out, to see whether any article of value has been left upon the bank of the river. The person supplying this information to me, who was for some time resident in the house, has seen brought home by these persons a drum of figs at one time, and a Dutch cheese at another. These were sold in small lots or slices to the other lodgers. The sanitary state of these houses is very bad. Not only do the lodgers generally swarm with vermin, but there is little or no ventilation to the sleeping rooms, in which 60 persons of the foulest habits usually sleep every night. There are no proper washing utensils, neither towels, nor basins, nor wooden bowls. There are only 1 or 2 buckets, but these are not meant for the use of the lodgers, but for cleaning the rooms. The lodgers never think of washing themselves. The cleanliest among them will do so in the bucket, and then wipe themselves with their pocket handkerchiefs or the tails of their shirts. According to the report of the Constabulary Force Commissioners, there were in the metropolis, in 1839, 221 of such houses as the one at present described, and each of these houses harbouring daily, upon an average, no less than 11 of such characters as the foregoing, making in all a total of 2,481 vagrants and pickpockets sheltered by the proprietors of the low lodging houses in London. The above twopenny lodging house has on average from 60 to 70 persons sleeping in it nightly, yielding an income of about £3 per week. The 3-penny lodging houses in the same neighbourhood average from 15 to 20 persons per night, and produce a weekly total of 20 to 25 shillings profit. The rent of the houses at the same time bring only 5 to 6 shillings per week.